One of the things that I'm going to allude to slightly is that we have been at this so long that there's actually a history. There's actually literally, depending on how you count, between 30 and 60 years of history in this movement. And we are not aware of half of it. Like, for example, I was not aware of what you told me. We're not necessarily aware of the European sequence of events, and you're not necessarily aware of the American sequence of events. And I know that Nir had a list of the organizations that are committed, that are working in parallel. You know, it was quite impressive, 6 or so. And actually there's probably 8 or 9. Yeah. And I think it's a kind of presentation, a commission presentation that allows us to understand how long we've been at this. And actually in self-criticism, assess whether we're losing ground or not. You know, if after 70 years, like if you begin, for example, with CM 59, you know, the last of the CM meetings, which were very critical of modernism, and you take it to yesterday, like, why haven't we succeeded when the world has never needed us more? Never has it been more necessary. And I think it kind of overall self-criticism of the movement, not just of the projects, would be a very interesting topic because it obsesses me. Like, how is it that we are where we are? You know, still, there's no historical precedent of a movement being insurgent for 70 years. Usually we win and we are actually, and then we lose within 70 years, let alone, I mean, we've been at it longer than the Soviet Union, for God's sake. You know? So let's find out what isn't working about what we're doing.
But what's so interesting is, and I think that's something which appeared in this conference or unconference, is all these new movements run by younger professionals or people, and you know, like in social activism, and they are kind of carrying, they are really taking the groundwork and carrying on and really disseminating it. And I think what's lagging behind is the education institutions. The institutions are lagging behind.
Yeah.
And the professionals, I think the professionals, at least you know, the generation of, like yesterday, people like Russell Wyndham. I was very, very impressed by Russell. I was very impressed by Mark Ferguson. So these people who have been around for a while and have a quite impressive amount of work. And they are so dedicated to kind of think about the succession, you know, who is kind of carrying on, who is doing that, and looking at the education. I think education is...
To start, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be probably the most meaningful of the 4 days. I really, you know, break a leg, everybody. Let's have a great deal of fun here. And I will never forget, Andres said, come down from the mountaintops and charge on the plains. This is it. Thank you very, very much all for being here. And I am letting everybody in the room. Is everybody ready? We're all good. Lucien?
Yeah, I'm good. I have to put on my hat.
Yeah, okay. Now we can start. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we have today what is arguably the most exciting day of the tag. Andres Duany has been leading the traditional movement for a very long time, and he is still here. He's still fresh. I think that there's something about longevity in dealing with this kind of knowledge. Welcome to day 4 at the STOA. We're going to start with housekeeping. The ground rules are that the classic planning STOA environment is one of open-mindedness and quality of discourse. Participants are encouraged to debate each other's ideas from positions of mutual respect and good manners. By joining a session or online thread, you agree to avoid ad hominem statements regarding individuals present or absent and sectarian, religious, partisan, political, or aesthetic ideologies for their own sake. In case of disagreement, we believe that all statements made in our community must be first heard, and then the parties submit to mediation until cordiality is resumed, or to the point of, I can live with this. Moderators will perform the duty of umpire of their own sessions. Infractions will lead to a warning and then ejection from a session. Judgment calls may not be questioned in real time. Session infractions will be addressed within 48 hours of the event closing by a quorum of 3 event organizers as elected by the organizing committee. You agree to these stipulations upon entering and participating in the STOA event, and you also provide us a media release to use whatever materials we record and have here. Are we recording, by the way? Can anybody confirm that from our use of this, especially, and if we are lucky enough to be able to create a little book bringing all together, you know, these really amazing days that we've spent together. In the event that you want a continuing education credit, please email to cgi@classicplanning.com with CEU in the subject line, and we will contact you back. You will also, since this is a completely voluntary platform, we're going to ask you to help pitch in to make all that work for us in the best way. Can you give? If every attendee of this STOA event donated $5, we could sponsor 2 students to learn traditional architecture and classic planning. So please consider giving to the Institute. We are a unique organization. I myself am very excited about working on the Extreme City Makeover video series, designing beautiful buildings and getting them built, and helping communities take control of their destinies once again. The Classic Planning Institute itself, what makes us really special is that we steward the classical method knowledge bases. And the classical method, the classical orders, and the classical orders of all the countries in the world, all the cultures in the world, are only a part of it. It's a very broad scoped set of knowledge bases. Some of them are mentioned in the Art of Classic Planning. Values unique to the CPI are: number 1, architecture is central to urbanism. It's like, duh, what do you see most when you're in a city? Buildings. Okay, that's important. We're genuinely holistic. Town and country is a focus of ours that is unique, something that we're bringing back to the discourse after over 100 years of open space and green belts and all kinds of other things that who knows what the hell they are. And we believe, we have come to recognize that manual construction and crafts may be essential for human, societal, and planetary well-being. That's a really heavy lift to figure that out and prove it, but it is no doubt at the basis of the good survival of humanity on this planet. The 5 divisions of the CPI are the studio, the academy, our research lab, where we have engaged in biometrics and so on, and the library, where we are intending to collect hard copy texts of the classic planning knowledge bases. Probably not 1,000 books out there that really tell you what to do on this planet if you want to survive. And finally, the STOA, our unaffiliated platform, which hosts community dialogue and events. You can join it on the Classic Planning Institute. We're looking to actually create an alternative to the listservs, which are limited in some of their capacities, and to the corporate, whatever they are, things on the social media, and bring people really closer together without any of those intermediaries, commercial or otherwise. Our unique professional curriculum, and this is something we're working on and does not happen almost anywhere as far as I know, is that we do require something equivalent to likely a master's degree in who knows what. But there's a whole list of prerequisites, whatever your passions were prior to wanting to work in the built environment. There's CPI coursework, and then we're going to require trades experience, travel requirements, and apprenticeship in a program that we hope to build equivalent to LEED certification or better. Our first year includes architectural literacy, classic planning, and 100-year plan studio. We're starting again in April. The architectural literacy includes the orders, includes composition, materials, elements, proportions, and a few projects to get you going. Classic planning basics are taught in a series of of 6 classes with many additional people from outside the CPI lecturing on their specifics. And then finally, we take a 100-year plan studio where we work from diagrams that seem to be somewhat simple to very quickly get into urbanism and ultimately architecture, which is the single most important thing in urbanism. Everything we do is graduate level, but highly accessible. And the one thing that has come out of this STOA already is that we're going to be teaching Vitruvius starting April 4th, every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. It's going to be a brand new kind of look at it because we're going to start with Vitruvius as a guy and wonder, you know, here's this guy who in his retirement, basically to get for himself an income from the emperor, wrote everything he knew or whatever was in there. So we're going to take a look at that as a reflection, a Roman reflection, a future past Roman reflection on life today or the upcoming life in the event that the dystopias that the modernists are leading us to actually do happen. We could be ready. Sign up at cgiclassicplanning.com with Vitruvius in the subject line. The minimum quorum is going to be 10 folks. Welcome to day 4 at the STOA. This is the 4th day. On the first day, we listened to Leon Creer, who discussed the completion of Washington, D.C. and sailing in the storm of a post-pandemic world. Look here at the list of the people who were on the panels and who so enriched the conversations. Day 2 was about neuroscience and trying to connect hand, hearts, and brains. Really challenging. We saw the beautiful movie by Don Ruggles, Built Beautiful, and many of you likely remember the wonderful movie we saw last night by Neely Portugali. Very, very touching, and really to the point of somewhere and everywhere that Robert Adam led the conversation on. Today, we're going to have Andres Duany speak to a number of things that are in his thinking today, his leading thinking today. Really, I think we need to listen. I always listen to Andres with great attention, and I find him always inspiring, whether I agree or not, or think I agree or don't think I agree or whatever. Originally, this was called Don't Tell Me Anything I Could Have Heard in the 20th Century, but it really is about the future because everything in the future we could not have heard in the 20th century. Andres himself is an architect whose work focuses on town and regional planning. He and his wife, Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk, founded their practice in 1980. Their design at that time of Seaside, Florida, began the ongoing debate that we're still continuing today on alternatives to suburban sprawl. Since then, DPZ, their planning practice, has over 200 plans in the process of implementation with particular expertise in writing codes. Andres and Elizabeth were founding members of the Congress for the New Urbanism. They teach at the University of Miami, where Elizabeth was Dean of the School of Architecture. And Andres has received multiple honorary doctorates, including from the University of Pennsylvania. He has received the Driehaus Prize, the Scully Prize, the Jefferson Medal, and the Brandeis Medal, and he'd get a Burris Medal if we were giving him. Among Andres's proudest accomplishments is his honorary membership in the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. According to him, they are truly the company of the sane. Dedicated to both practice and research, recent books by DPZ are Garden Cities, Theory and Practice of Agrarian Urbanism, and current research is on transition towns. Andres and Elizabeth have co-authored Suburban Nation, The New Civic Art, and the Smart Growth Manual. They and DPZ have inspired countless books and articles, and the idea of this flow of knowledge and construction and life in these spaces is kind of addressed in summary maybe by by Andres in his work, great work in progress, the Heterodoxia Architectonica. I gave it that name, but I'm not sure if that's the name, but it is called the Heterodoxia as far as I know. And he speaks of something called a recall to order. The great treatises of the Renaissance were conceived as a first recall to order. The 20th century's fourth recall was the latest attempt to correct the drift of modernism and deconstructivism, and it failed. Perhaps this is because it was the only recall that did not generate treatises specific to its purpose, and we remember complexity and condition and contradiction in architecture by the greats Venturi, Robert Venturi, and Scott Brown. What a sad state of affairs that normal traditional architecture is considered complex and contradictory simply because the people were architecturally illiterate. Never has a recall been more necessary, and Leon Creer's architecture of community was clearly written with future generations in mind. Andres's treatise, which we so look forward to, is a fifth recall to order treatise, and he may touch on that in the conversation today. I want you all to welcome Andres Duany to this very, very special, I think for all of us, moment in time. Andres, whoops, there you go. It's all Andres now.
Nir and Lucien, thank you for organizing this. It is just a wonderful thing, and I should just make a couple of just a notation as to that title which you put out, which is I don't want to hear anything I heard in the 20th century. That was actually when you first invited me, I was telling you why I wouldn't attend, because I'm just tired of going to conferences that literally consist of talks I could have heard in the 20th century. And it's a challenge that actually is usually picked up with some embarrassment, but it's an effective challenge to say, what are we confronting now? And I'd like to remind people of a kind of extraordinary historical symmetry, which is that the century does not click over at the 00 year. It usually clicks over 20 years later. Like, for example, what we're confronting now in 2020, including the essential failure of Glasgow, including what the Russians are doing, but many, many other things like the potential crapshoot and meltdown of the economic system. All of the things that are happening now, the instability, is actually quite similar to 1920, not to 1900. 1920, there was a complete collapse of empires. There was poverty. There was incredible radicalization politically, not just in Russia, but everywhere. And there was the depression to follow. It was actually I think one of the things that distracts us is that the Roaring 20s was for a very small segment of the population. Most of the world was starving and dying. And even the pandemic, the 1918 pandemic and our own pandemic is analogous. And then before that, lest you need a confirmation, after Waterloo in 1816, the instability in Europe was extraordinary. You know, their 1920s, and it wasn't pulled together until about 40 or 50 years later with Victorian times. And here we are in something that is just so clear that we need to confront what is happening now. And there are really very few, sorry, my computer keeps shutting down. It's a challenge. I want to get people excited about the challenge. I don't want to push back on classicism or the efforts of others. I want to expand the mission so that it excites the best of the young people. And one of the things that I want to remind all of us who are present here is that the first generation that recovered classicism was heroic. You know, the Venturi you alluded to, the Michael Graves, the Alan Greenberg, the Italians of CM59 at Waterloo, all of these people were marginalized. Many of them sacrificed their careers. Many of the students who are here now leading, of the architects who are here now leading, when they went to school and they were isolated as classicists and traditionalists, they were heroes. They were really heroes. Just listen to the stories of what it was like to go to school in the 80s and 90s when you were the only traditionalist in the school. And so now we confront a new generation, literally 30 years later, and we tell them stories of victories past. You know, we say, well, back in 1980, when we did this, or Venturi did that. No one is interested in the smoke of battles past. They want to have their own mission. And what I want to refer to today is how do we transfer that sense of mission to the young so we attract the best of the young, okay? And most of the best of the young, Venturi and the Italian New Liberty people and people like Greenberg, okay? So that's really what I'm speaking about. It's gonna seem like a criticism of classicism, but it's actually an expansion and a challenge for it. Now, the heart of the criticism is that the fourth recall to order, there have been fourth recalls, does not only have its own treatises, it is fixated on the treatises of the Renaissance. And the treatises of the Renaissance had a very specific purpose, and they succeeded in deflecting the course of architecture. And the purpose was the general whatever, the general looseness of Gothic architecture, which actually had a very, very, I can't get into it at this moment, but there was a looseness to the sequence after Rome, after the collapse of Rome, of Romanesque and Gothic, which was very disturbing to those of the Enlightenment who wanted clarity. And Vitruvius' treatise was discovered at just the right time. It was completely manipulated for the purposes of the first recall to order. The second recall to order was after the Napoleonic Wars, which was about actually the restoration of order after the, I would call, the dissipation of Baroque and Rococo, a kind of recall to seriousness that was led principally by Germans, but it was actually based on Logier and that recall to order. Now, the third recall to order was after eclecticism, after the drift of eclecticism, that excitement of finding everything all over the world and picking up orders from everywhere, and everything was possible and open, and it was incredibly, in the eyes of some, absolutely grotesque. And the third recall to order was the academic. Our current fourth recall to order is a response to the increasing first dysfunction and current degeneracy of modernism, in which anything goes, nothing has meaning, it's nothing but very superficial stars, random stuff is prized. I don't have to tell you what's going on now, and yet we fail. Never have we had a more vulnerable opponent, never. And never has the failure of classicism be so complete. We are in retreat, okay? And the treatise that I'm writing is not for us. It's not for this group. It's for the fifth recall to order, it's for the young. Like what happens after classicism finally melts down, which is modernism, and it is beginning to see its feet of clay. How are they responding, and how will we join that response? How will we join them, not fight them, but join them in actually the restoration of what can only be called a recall to order. It's the fifth. And so that's the treatise I've been writing for quite a while on the side. It's kind of a hobby, but you should know that we have finished 360 plates of the highest quality, all of heterodox orders. We have analyzed in a minuscule way over 60 treatises. It isn't just about Vitruvius, and it isn't just about Spinoza. There are 60 treatises, all of which had to be written for a reason. Not because, I want to be cool, but they all had a point to make. They all had a point of moving the discourse forward. And we cannot be, the fourth recall to order cannot be all about Vitruvius and all about Palladio and all about Vignola. Now, that doesn't mean you discard it, because here's where the strength of classicism comes in. The strength of classicism is that it discards nothing. It doesn't discard nothing. The weakness of modernism is that it always discards its immediate past. It builds on nothing. We don't discard anything, but yet we add. Okay, if you look at the last 400 years of the classical discourse, we add and we add and we add and we add as we discover, as we rationalize, as we insert into the academy. Okay, that's what's been happening for 400 years, but not us. We do not add. We actually retain the purity of the Renaissance. Now, what's the analogy that I've made that Nir alluded to? We speak our greatest explanation, and it gives me an absolute horror when I hear it, is we do this because of beauty. Beauty. Okay, and people will come to beauty. What we have done, which the new urbanists have definitely not done, is we have established a battlement. We have a redoubt on the hill, high on the hill, based on virtue, and it's got a very, very defined edge. And people who step outside the redoubt are what happens when a person is removed. There's another religious term.
Anathema.
A heresiarch. It's a heresy. It's a heresy to manipulate, actually, the Vignola and the Scamozzi treatises. Okay, it's a heresy. And so we have a very strong delineated redoubt, and we raise the banners of beauty. And we expect the people to notice our banners and come in and join us. Modernism does exactly the opposite. They actually go in and they engage in the plains. They engage, they get dirty, okay? And they engage developers, and they engage the common culture, and they engage the high culture, you know, and they engage the avant-garde. They are taking territory. They're continually taking territory while we are defending ours. And the problem is that they're actually increasing their territory. Like if you look back at 1990, I'd like to remind people, because I've been studying this. In 1990 or 1985, Frampton, of all people, would write, this is right after the exhibit of the Beaux-Arts exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. At the Museum of Modern Art, the Beaux-Arts exhibit, and Frampton says, alas, we must now confront the restoration of traditionalism for at least a generation. Just read the writing, read the tone of the writing, read the tone of the historiography that was being written in 85. We had won, okay? Now, one of the things that we did when we designed Seaside, we invited architects of all kinds to design, and many of the current modernists, the avant-gardists who were young then, actually did traditional buildings for us. You can actually see that in David Money's book. We had absolutely won, and then we lost it. And the reason we lost is that modernism did not sit still. They were not the modernism we were criticizing. They became popular. They became cozy. They actually gave up on technical materials and returned to wood and stone. They let light in. What the problem that we have when we criticize the modernists, and I'm going to make the case, we define ourselves by the critique of modernism, unfortunately. The problem with modernists is that our critique is out of date. Okay, when we say, oh, the glass wall is an environmental disaster, guess what? It isn't. Okay, it isn't. It meets LEED standards. When we say, well, the flat roofs leak, sorry, they don't. They did, but they no longer leak, because then there'd be nothing but lawsuits. The flat roofs don't leak. It's stupid to say the flat roofs leak. It's stupid when glass buildings actually meet LEED standards with triple glazing to say they don't work. In fact, and there's reasons why architects who don't even like the glass aesthetic are forced to use it. And we don't even know the reason they do. Do we know why architects who don't like glass walls use glass walls? Well, we should know about that. What is it about that forces that modernism has established? What relationships has it established to industry that makes the glass wall infinitely more dependable than a wooden window inserted into a masonry building? What is the protocol? We don't know it. We don't know it because we don't care to know it, because of our higher morality. So all of these things are happening. And by the way, yesterday I did hear, mostly the argument has been good, but yesterday I heard somebody saying, well, we are more popular. You know, 60% of the people want traditional architecture. And I say, well, that may be, but where's the other 40%? What about the other 40%? Have we looked into the 40%? Okay, why are they there? And by the way, Why are 95% of the periodicals, including all the big ones, modernist? Okay, and ours are incredibly marginalized. They practically have to be given away. What happened to architectural design? Okay, why is it 90% modernist? What happened to Côte Sud, the best of the traditional magazines in Europe? Okay, now they have modernism. It's not worth buying. What happened to the schools in which we had 24 schools that had the least programs? We're down to 3. We're down to 3. These famous students that love traditional architecture in the modernist architecture school, sure, yes, 1%, 2%, 2 per class. Okay, our school is, which what used to be a traditional school is now a 95% modernist school, because the appeal of modernism, the glamour, okay, all false. It's a polemic, but the methods, the glamour, the way it's presented is so superior to ours. So here's the problem that I want to engage. We define ourselves by our opposition to modernist architecture. Okay, therefore we become increasing experts in their failures. Salingaros is an expert in why it fails, and we don't see their successes. We have no idea why they succeed. We just don't. We think, oh, it's all bullshit. We don't want to learn that. It's not bullshit. It's incredibly brilliant why they succeed. So we don't see their successes, so we do not learn from their successes. At the same time, one of the interesting themes, the leitmotifs of this conference, is that we find there's an increasing openness to traditional architecture. That's what's said several times. Do you know what that means? That means they're learning from us. We are not learning from them because of the hard line we've set, and yet they're smart enough to be learning from us. Notice, for example, that Robert Adam was actually showing buildings by modernists that were actually brick. Okay, brick. Now, why are they doing brick? Brick was anathema, anything but brick. Anathema. They now have punch windows, they have bay windows, they're all modernists. Why are they gradually learning from us? And by the way, another of the things they've done, he said that Richard Rogers could make a presentation in urbanism, which he could have given without any improvement. The modernists have taken on traditional urbanism. Have we learned anything from modernist urbanism? Do we think that actually modernist urbanism has nothing to contribute? Yes, of course, it doesn't have anything to contribute. It ruined the world. That's not true. That's not at all true. There's much to be learned. So what we have set up in the fourth recall is an asymmetrical relationship in which they are allowed to have intelligence about us. They spy on us, they learn from us, whatever works they take on, and we learn nothing from them. In fact, we spiral inward as we become ever more pure. That is horrendous strategy, horrendous. And we are on the defensive and they are on the aggression, and we're gonna get nowhere. Okay, now, what is the modernist weakness? That they discard everything. They start anew every time. And there is very little communication with the people. One of the problems with modernism, their persistent lack of popularity, is that no one can become a connoisseur of modernism. Because the minute you do, if you're a regular person, the minute you do, and you say, well, I actually understand Steve Hall. I understand why he uses glass that way. I understand why the compositions are that way. And then you show them the next Steve Hall building and they say, I hate that because Steve Hall has moved on. That is an incredible flaw. Okay, and our strength is that we build on the past. Our weakness is that we don't learn from the future. We don't learn from the future. We don't even learn from the present. Okay. Now, there are several things that are of absolutely that are of absolute value. Like, for example, okay, do we really think that the glass wall is a problem? Okay, if you do, you know nothing of the traditional architects of the 1930s, and you know nothing about Leo Carrere. How big his windows are. Okay, how he has that in the repertoire. Okay, what about the pilotis? What about raising a building on pilotis? Oh, that's terrible. Have you seen the latest pilotis? They're not your grandmother's pilotis. They're fabulous. They're very tall. They're the only way you can actually create a cathedral-shaped space. Like you just take the Unité, raise it 2 more stories, and you've got a cathedral underneath. We have those in Miami. The pilotis has been recovered. We don't even know that. We won't even look at that. Okay, the corner window. Ooh, the corner window. Do you know what that does to space? To have 2 windows in the corner instead of punched through. Do you know how much easier it is to furnish a room? No, we don't know how much easier it is to furnish a room, because we don't know why the corner window was introduced. We just don't do it. It's illegal. It's outside the discourse. It's outside the battlements. What about the cantilever? Not the little bracketed cantilever, which is all about the bracket and nothing about the cantilever. What about the cantilever that is awesome? The awesome cantilever, okay? That existed in tradition as well. What about the facade, which is irregularly composed? Not everything all along. I mean irregularly composed. Okay, not only does the vernacular do that, but the Scandinavian classicists did that. Whenever the Scandinavian classicists built in the countryside their villas, you know, the Asplunds, the Ostbergs, they were allergic to lining up windows, absolutely allergic. They said, why should we do that? We're so far from Rome. We're so far from Stockholm. It is as vulgar as a Texan ranch with French wrought iron gates. That's how vulgar they thought that classicism in the countryside was in the 1920s. And they wrote about this. Do we know about that? We don't know about that. Like, why did Ostberg make villas that were as if they were indistinguishable from peasant villas? Because he had the modesty to understand how far he was from Rome. And we don't do that. Wherever we build, wherever we, the traditional classicists build, it has to be as correct as Palladio, in fact, more correct than Palladio. I think it's a pathetic vulgarity and an absolute misunderstanding of the full range of classicism to go from urban and cosmopolitan to rural. Okay, and that is, by the way, what Serlio's 3 theatrical scenes were about. Those were not theatrical sets. Serlio's 3 scenes were not actually propositions for the theater. They were actually 3 linguistic settings. The problem is that he didn't have linguistics as a science. What he had was rhetoric. In those days, he could only communicate through rhetoric. So he said, these are theatrical scenes. But you can translate Vitruvius's text to Serlio and say, this is linguistics. Vernacular, idiomatic, academic, exactly the same. Okay? But we never look at it that way. We do it as scholars and say, well, we never ask, what did Serlio really mean? What is this ridiculous thing about the 3 theatrical scenes? Why was the concern? They were actually transmitting to us, okay, the declension of vernacular, idiomatic, and classical, and rural to urban, and cosmopolitan, and civic to private. All that is built into that, but we don't read that because we look at it from their eyes instead of our eyes. Keeping going. Have you seen the flat roof, the roof garden? The roof garden is one of the great inventions of the last 10 years. Every good restaurant is in the roof now, every good bar, and yet we don't do flat roofs. Why not? Oh, well, they leak. No, they don't leak. Okay, they don't leak. I'm sorry, they don't leak. And what about the diagonal echelon against the street? What about, remember the modernist invention of the diagonal echelon as opposed to the facade as a wall? That's in history as well. Okay, those architects of the 1920s, not the Art Deco architects, okay, but the really, really smart Mittel Europa architects, the Germans and the Hungarians, they were fascinated. They were as inventive as the modernists within actually a traditional language. I've been doing with COVID, I've been designing echelon facades to create loggias that have 2 corners open, where you can actually have, that are as large as the living room, where you can meet your guests outdoors and where you can do your yoga outdoors. A real outdoor room, the way that it was fascinating to Le Corbusier in his immeuble villas. Now I want to bring something up about Leo Krier. You don't know this, but Leo Krier is redesigning all of Le Corbusier in a traditional style. What has he discovered that's so interesting? He has discovered that the modernist parties are incredibly vigorous and useful. The modernist parties, but the modernist language is weak, it's desiccated, it doesn't communicate. Okay, so what he has done is he has combined the modernist party with the traditional language. And the buildings he's done probably over 50 redesigns of Le Corbusier are incredibly powerful. He takes the immeuble villas of Le Corbusier, or he takes the Villa Chaudin and makes them traditional. It's the most powerful thing you've ever seen. We actually do the opposite. Actually, in the 1950s, the mistake of Philip Johnson and those first classicists is that they took the very desiccated traditionalist parties, which are all Palladian and symmetrical and really have extremely narrow repertoire, and actually put the modernist facades on them, like Lincoln Center. So what they combined was weakness with weakness. And Leo Creer is combining strength with strength. And that's one of the great futures we have. We have to get the DNA, sympathize with the DNA. And this all comes from one incredible mistake, which is, where do we draw the line that says, this is traditionalism and that's modernism? Like, let's just take Macintosh. Okay, no one that I know here in this entire group gives a damn about Macintosh other than, there's no knowledge, there's a kind of vague sympathy. Oh yes, I visited Hill House, you know, whatever. Okay, so but Macintosh is a traditional architect, completely. The Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School, with sympathetic eyes, is the last and greatest of the Greek revivals. The last and greatest of the Greek revivals, and yet because we draw the line that excludes it, we have actually granted the Prairie School to the modernists, which they learn nothing from, but it's like a medal. Okay, this is my authority. We have granted them a cultural heritage which is not theirs, it's ours, because we drew the line too tight in the 1920s. We have to loosen where we draw the boundary of our redoubt. We have to take dozens and dozens and dozens of architects from the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and bring them into the redoubt. Because right now, no one's using them, and they're the strength that we have. So we have to redraw. The first thing, and what heterodoxia does many things. It's 3 volumes. It's 1,000 pages, okay? But what heterodoxia does, among other things, is redraw the line of what traditionalism is. And it proves that actually what the so-called pioneers of the modern movement were actually traditionalists. So how should we define ourselves if not in opposition to urbanism? I think we define ourselves 3 different ways. First of all, let's remind everybody that we have a seat at the table because we have the 3rd skill. Everybody does words, many people do numbers, but nobody draws. Only the architects draw. Whenever we show up and we draw, we solve problems that are intractable to numbers and to so our seat at the table comes from our fantastic ability to draw. And we should continually prove that we can solve problems by drawing, and not problems of esoterica, of classical, but real life problems. We can solve them, intractable problems, particularly urban problems, problems of the acceptance of taller buildings or denser buildings, or problems of affordability. You know, we can solve them by drawing. The second thing that makes us different is that, unlike the modernists, we actually are incredibly concerned with the humans and the humane. They are not. They have other concerns. Now, the concerns are often honorable: pioneering materials, expressing environmentalism, expressing the innards of the building, the circulation, etc. They often actually express the culture. Yes, they do. They express the culture. When a miserable building is done by Rem Koolhaas, for example, like the student center at IIT, which is a building that is absolutely would be insulting to any of us. And the students come in. I was there at the opening. The students are so comfortable. The students have a perfect fit with that building, perfect. Because what Rem is doing is responding to the culture, okay? We don't respond to the culture, we reform the culture. There are two traditions. The modernism, the current modernism that actually expresses the culture in all its degeneracy of junk space, and the old modernism that tries to reform the culture. We are solidly of the tradition of reform. We own that tradition, they don't. They don't reform a damn thing, they just express it. We can take that back and say, we are the true reformers and we are the true modernists. And those guys are artists, bless them. We know their skill, we know their value, but they're not reformers, okay? They're actually expressing and supporting what is essentially the degeneration of Western culture. And the world is ready for the recovery of Western culture, okay? So that is something that we can do, that we can actually do. Now, what is the mission of the young? And the mission of the young is not, I'm sorry, it's not Vitruvius. It's what Vitruvius would have done. Now, I attended the École des Beaux-Arts in the last of the intact ateliers that de Gaulle was taking apart. Atelier Lamache, and this is what they taught me. Do not do what Phidias did. Do what Phidias would have done. Would have done. And emulation is not imitation. Imitation is do what Phidias did. Emulation is what would Phidias have done. What would Phidias have done to express, let's say, environmentalism? What would Phidias have done, okay, to deal with COVID? Think that way. We're not thinking that way at all. We're trying to actually inhabit this spirit, we're trying to inhabit the body of Phidias, not the spirit of Phidias. It's a tremendous error. It's not what the Beaux-Arts taught, and that the power of the Beaux-Arts was emulation, it's agility. It's agility to actually keep up and respond to all the programs at the time of railway stations, of very fast building. Now I want to point something out that is not recorded enough. At the turn of the century, 1900, the arts and crafts was absolutely dominant all over the world. All the great architects, Lutyens was an arts and crafts architect, Boise was an arts and crafts architect, Norman Shaw was an arts and crafts architect, all over Europe, the Scandinavian class, the Scandinavians, Saarinen, they were all arts and crafts architects. The problem with arts and crafts architect is that the architect has to be there working with a workman, laying out the brick and visually adjusting the detail. Fabulous architecture. Within 5 years in Edwardian time, every one of the arts and crafts architects was a classicist. Every one. Lutyens he spun on a dime. Norman Shaw spun on a dime. Has anybody read why they became classicists? Because in the Edwardian expansion before the First World War, which is very similar to ours, it was too inefficient, they couldn't deliver. Okay, New Delhi couldn't have been arts and crafts because Lutyens didn't have the time to be building huge buildings. They had to rebuild Regent Street from top to bottom in 5 years. It couldn't have been arts and crafts. So what happened is they realized that classicism was normative. They realized that it was like Henry Ford. They realized that a cornice was a cornice. They realized that a column, you could design one according to the book and order 200 to be delivered to New Delhi. It was an amazing efficiency. That efficiency of classicism is something that we need to saddle. Classicism is the only prefabricated open shelf system that you find now in Home Depot. It's the only one. If you say, give me a mold, if you say, give me a baseboard or give me a door or give me a doorknob, it's not modernist, it's classicist. It's an open system. And yet we insist on saying, no, we don't do that. It's not good enough for us. Oh, it's made out of vinyl or, whatever. So yeah, it's made out of vinyl. The problem is not vinyl because actually classicism has been using for 100 years composite materials. The problem is the profile. The problem is that the profile is incorrect. And what is more, the profile cannot be one of stone. It is one of vinyl. Vinyl does not make sharp corners. Okay, so who is going to be the Ruskin of vinyl? Who is going to be the person that takes, the original orders when iron came in to be used as a material? They would make these fat columns to emulate Doric, which actually is a syntax of stone. Yes, stone has to be that big. It doesn't have the compressive strength, but iron does. Iron doesn't, and yet all the original columns were iron, and all the original wood columns that we built in America had the syntax, the profile of the stone of Greece. Well, that's idiotic. Now, how did we permit ourselves to do that? Because we only had one treatise, which is the Renaissance treatise. If you look at the other 60 treatises, half of them actually have propositions for wooden columns and for steel columns. And that's what Viollet-le-Duc did. And that's what Schinkel did, of all people. Schinkel had wooden orders. We never see them. What does Creer do? Creer has orders of every single dimension and proportion based on the material. The Fourth Recall doesn't do that. Everything all comes as if we were still in Greece. Okay, our language is so limited because we do not even know our own tradition. We're back at day one. We're back at Palladio. We're back at the discovery of Vitruvius. Unbelievably, 500 years ago. And it's going to get nowhere. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Nir. It's been tried. Okay, what you're attempting to do by teaching Vitruvius, it has been tried. It isn't going to work any bit better this time than last time. What should be taught are the subsequent treatises. Why don't you do the, do you know that Schinkel did a treatise called the Lehrbuch? No. Well, it's not Palladian. No, it's got a full range. It knows how to make an order which is in the basement. It knows how to make an order which expresses that's in the Black Forest. It knows how to make an order which is a Prussian arsenal. Okay, how do you express a Prussian arsenal? And how do you express a cottage in the Black Forest? Differently. That's how you do it. I rarely meet a classicist today that actually knows Schinkel, except, yeah, in a kind of postcard way. What has happened to us? We've discarded 400 years of the building. We need to challenge the young people to recover that, not just to recover what we have already recovered. We cannot be people who rediscovered the Ferrari, and then we teach the next generation to polish the Ferrari. Okay, that's all we're doing. No, excuse me. We discovered the Ferrari, we rebuilt the threshold, Thomas Gordon Smith, Robert Adams, we've all recovered it beautifully, we've dusted it off, now you get to polish it. Who the hell that's young wants to polish a Ferrari? They want to drive it to the edge of the precipice to show how it performs. That's what they want to do. And the greatest architect of the 20th century was not Le Corbusier, it was Plečnik. Plečnik drove the Ferrari of classicism to the edge of the precipice. And guess what? Sometimes he crashed. And it was absolutely magnificent. Okay, there's some kids that want to crash. They want to do dangerous things. And that's the appeal of modernism. The ability to crash, the ability to take risks and fail. We are so allergic to failure. We are so afraid of the opprobrium of our highly educated fellows. We are afraid of the ICA's arched. Have you ever been criticized by the ICA when they arch their eyebrow? I mean, it's just like, it's devastating. I don't give a shit what the ICA thinks of the classicism of my friends. Okay, I give a shit what they think of my bow tie. I do give a shit about that. And I try very hard, but I don't give a goddamn if they think I've deviated from Palladio. And we cannot let this organization that is so open, so full of potential, become another ICA or another Notre Dame for that matter. Okay, the world doesn't need it. The world needs a revolutionary movement. Okay, and a revolutionary movement that is based on actually what is best for humans, not what's new, but whatever is best in the long run has got to be our material, not whatever was best 400 years ago. You know, when I hear of classicism saying, well, it is a permanent beauty. What? Permanent beauty? And then they show the three columns with, you know, the warrior and the lady and the virgin with the basket on the head. You gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. Have you looked at a newspaper ad yesterday, a fashion ad? Okay, the men look like waifs and the women look like athletes. It's backwards. Okay, the current ideal, physical ideal, is exactly the opposite. Just look at the New York Times ads with fashion, and you'll see that the men are feminine and the women are masculine. And we still tell them, well, you know, this is like a maiden. You know, the Ionic is a maiden. You got to be kidding. And then we say, well, you know, well, Athena, the goddess that is the protectress of the city, right? So you're going to do a Doric column because of Athena? Nobody knows what Athena is, let alone what a Doric column is. And there is so much to express. And all of that was expressed in all the other 60 treatises that we know nothing about. So I would urge you, actually, this group, to actually be different, not to not be classicists, but be truly classicists. Truly classicists, the way that the vitality of classicism, not some dead academic Renaissance thing that, well, it wasn't relevant even 50 years later. Even 50 years later, okay, Michelangelo had to do some excitement. The Baroque had to be introduced. The world was bored to death of Palladio, bored to death. You know, the Brits maybe not, but of course, you know, they love the boredom. But the world was bored to death of Palladio. They had to invent Baroque. They had to invent Rococo. They had to go completely degenerate. And then, of course, there was the recall to order of the Greeks that were discovered in Paestum. And then they said, well, that was fun, that discovery. And they kept discovering additional orders. And then eclecticism came in and everybody said, God, that's gross. And then the Academy came back and straightened them out. And then the Academy was so easy to attack by the modernists. The academicians of the Beaux-Arts, so easy. Corbu could just flick them aside, okay, with just a couple of images. And then modernism degenerated. But we don't have the equipment to fight the modernists if we're back at the Renaissance. It's not the right equipment. We should admire it as history, but it's not our arsenal. Our arsenal is much more exciting, and it is yet to be discovered. That's not what I meant to say, but that's what I said. Okay, so I'm done. I didn't show any images.
No images, but can you get us the list of 63 treatises, please?
Well, it's in the first volume of, yes, I can give you the list. And actually, the way we address them is, one of the things about the treatises is that they are tripartite. There's a technical part, you know, about how to build an aqueduct. There is a part that shows building types, and there's a third part, which are the orders. And the orders are the DNA, and the orders are permanent. The orders are permanent. The other stuff is discarded every 50 years. So our treatises, we show the cover, and we analyze the parallel, where they show the orders relative to each other. By the way, the orders are boring individually. They're only interesting relative to each other. It's only the relative aspect of them that makes them interesting.
I really think, you know, it's hard for me to say that any single thing you mentioned, and this is really for the response panel to get into, we should really introduce them right away. Nothing that you have said, I think I would individually disagree with. I think that the overall, the arch of what you say, I think, to me, is the real interesting, thing of the conversation. For example, when I read Alberti, and he goes on and on and on and on, at the end of the day, all that damn book is, he's trying to show his erudition. However, it's not about design. If you actually read his section on foundations, you understand the guy was very passionate about building.
Yes, but it's out of date. But it's out of date. That's the problem. Yes, he was great. It was.
I'm not so sure about
the way we do foundations. No,
I know from what I know. From what
Well,
I
this-
know,
Yeah,
I have two
America?
years of civil engineering, unfortunately, as
Yeah.
a result of which I'm starting to see that the old methods of construction, maybe they had something there. But
Yes,
having
but-
dug my own foundations, in work, I understood the passion for the foundation of stuff. Anyways, you read
but there's new
Palladio,
kinds of
not for the
foundations.
drawings.
There's
What?
new kinds of foundations for wooden buildings. He didn't know about wooden buildings. He didn't know. There's so
Oh,
many.
yeah, I didn't do them where
I'm
he
not saying
was.
discard those foundations, but there's new kinds of foundations that are not in the discourse, and yet we use them
Right,
every day.
right. Let's get on with the show here. Lucien, please introduce the panel and their fearless leader, Jaime. And let's get some action going here.